Just about half of American Airlines' mainline planes aren't owned by American Airlines. And for other major US airlines, leasing has become a bigger slice of their fleet strategy. Delta, United, Southwest, even Alaska Airlines, which only operates about 200 planes, they don't own a lot of the aircraft that they fly. Take it one step further, famous Malaysia 370. That wasn't Malaysia Airlines' plane either. In fact, in the 70s, airlines in the US owned practically all of their planes, and since then, fleet ownership has shrunk to about 60% as of late 2022. And in Europe, it's down to 30%. Airlines own the napkins, the websites, the high production safety videos, but they don't own the planes. And this has created a hidden billion-dollar industry of, well, plane rentals. Every time we fly, we are putting our lives in the hands of the pilots, the air traffic controllers, the maintenance crew, and that trust is sort of personified in that brand that's painted on the tail. And we may trust some brands more than others. There's a hidden player in that transaction, one that few people know about, one that doesn't show up anywhere in your plane ticket, the true owner of the plane. So who do we hold accountable when something goes wrong? And how did the industry get this way? Now imagine you're the COO of an airline like United Airlines. Let's call it Hustle Airlines. Now you're building a spreadsheet to predict how many planes you're gonna need next year. Now hypothetically, you forecast that in 2026, your company is gonna transport about 180 million people to around 300 destinations, over 1.6 million flights in the entire year. And your current fleet of about 1,000 aircraft just can't meet the demand. And you also have about 150 old jets that you need to get rid of because they're old. So you're left needing around 250 new planes to just operate next year. Plane prices range from around $100 million or more for the standard narrow body jets these days, the Boeing 737 or the Airbus A321, to over $350 million or more for the Boeing 777 or the Airbus A380s. Let's say that you decide to buy 250 narrow body jets to add to your fleet. Well, that's like a $29 billion invoice that you need to pay, which the airline most certainly does not have. No airline has that kind of cash just sitting there. It's also just too risky to just spend all this money at once. Okay, fine. So we'll finance it. With a 20% down payment, that's nearly $6 billion up front, plus at least $100 million a month just in interest. But that isn't even the biggest problem. You should have run these numbers like 10 years ago, because that's the current delivery backlog that these companies are facing. Boeing has 5,600 planes in a backlog and Airbus 8,600 planes. And even if you had done your homework, how could you have anticipated a pandemic, a percentage of your fleet grounded due to a manufacturing defect, new competitors, or just tariffs? You would not be the first airline exec in this exact predicament. 3 immigrants saw an opportunity to cash in on this all the way back in 1973. They were working as aircraft brokers and sensed there was a need for a financial vehicle to relieve airlines of the financial burdens of wide-bodied aircraft. So they founded the International Lease Finance Corporation, ILFC, which is now part of the world's largest lessor of planes with over 1,700 planes in its inventory, but I'll get to that soon. Now the company's first deal was leasing a DC-851 to Aeromexico. Now back then, airline companies hadn't found a need to use leasing, mainly because they just had easy access to capital. But everything changed in 1978. This is a year that brought a shock to the entire airline industry.
An effort that culminated, of course, in the passage of the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978.
1978 was a huge turning point for US airlines. Now before then, fares and routes that airlines would fly were super heavily regulated, but with a perk. Airlines got a subsidy or an incentive to fly these less profitable routes. So in other words, profits for airlines were almost guaranteed by the government. Competition was very limited and there was barely any financial risk. Then comes 1978 and deregulation. This means that they could fly the routes that the market thought was more interesting, ditch the routes that are not profitable, but no more subsidies. Now, the Airline Deregulation Act came with a whole set of problems, which we made a whole video about, but crucially, it meant that airlines now had to really tighten their belts and operate profitably. Now, after this change, the percentage of planes that airlines leased took off. Get it? Skyrocketed. Now, new airlines also came into the picture, and these brand new companies just didn't have the capital to buy a whole fleet of planes outright. And so new lessors came into the market too. GPA, for example, which was founded by Irishman Tony Ryan, a former Aer Lingus executive. And they're gonna be really important soon. Now, if you had quizzed me about an industry that owns hundreds of planes and leases them out to your favorite airline, I would not have had a clue. And there are a bunch of companies that are secretly reshaping travel around the world, and most people just don't know about them. The Hustle team put together a neat little report of the top 50 companies that are reshaping transportation, including Archer, eHang, and Whisk, which might actually make sci-fi air taxis a reality.
Buckle up.
You can download the report for free here or here. So now is probably a good time to explain why these economics work for both lessors and lessees. But for that, we need a different hat. It's more like a CFO hat, or like a vest. Okay, so first let's say that I'm the airline. I make revenue from ticket sales, from overpriced checked bags, and my costs are the fuel, pilots, airport fees, the crappy food that I serve. And if you take revenue minus costs, we get a company's gross profit. But of course, there's other stuff that you spend that I, the airline, have to pay. My marketing expenses, the office, that COO guy, and we usually would call those operating expenses. And if you add some other expenses in there, like your interest payments and your loans, subtract all that, you'll get your net profit, which of course you pay taxes on. Now, when you buy a plane, where does the cost of this plane go? Well, it's not a cost really, and it's not an operating expense either, because when you pay for a plane, the money that you pay, it doesn't go away, because this thing is an asset. You now own this thing, it's worth something. And the fact that it's still worth something means that you just can't write it off that easily.
Jerry, all these big companies, they write off everything.
Assets go on your balance sheet, and the only thing that you can write off this thing is the depreciation. That is the value of the plane that you lose every year because of wear and tear, because of a scratched paint, and the smell from the passenger that puked on the carpet. But it's a highly regulated number. You need to pilot through a bunch of compliance rules to get this number right.
You don't even know what a write-off is.
Now, when you lease a plane, you are not buying any assets. None of that balance sheet, loan, interest, depreciations, none of that complicated stuff you need to work on. That's somebody else's problem. Your only concern is the monthly lease, and you can usually write off that monthly payment from your taxes. Now, leasing a plane costs anywhere between $400,000 to $1 million a month, of course, depending on the type of plane. So is it better to lease or to buy? Here's some simple napkin math for you. If you lease that A321 for say 20 years, you'd be paying about $96 million in total. And then you'd have to return this plane. Almost the price of buying a new plane, right? So why don't you just go and buy it? Well, buying is just not as simple. Unless you're paying cash, which nobody is, buying requires a down payment, and then the monthly interest, and then amortizing the loan. So financing this plane over 20 years would cost $160 million after you account for all of these interest expenses. Now, you do get a plane after 20 years, but is that plane worth the difference? Because it has certainly depreciated a lot over 20 years. Also, you didn't get that sweet, simple expense that you can write off for your taxes. You had to do all that depreciation math. And even more crucially, ownership is very risky. You have the down payments, you have the 20-year mortgage. It's not called a mortgage, but you know what I mean. You could instead just lease this plane for 6 years and then just renew if you actually need the plane. Now, leasing lets airlines focus on what matters to them. That's marketing, that's trust, that's convincing you that paying extra for a carry-on is a better deal for you in the end. And that has its own set of challenges and risks, but the mortgage risk, the risk of down payments, the risk of buying an inventory of billions of dollars in planes and then keeping that in your balance sheet, that's the lessor's problem. Now, remember those guys from GPA? Well, their forecast didn't really account for the 1991 Gulf War, and that almost killed the company. It had to be acquired/salvaged by a bigger fish, in this case GE Capital. Because the more customers a lessor has, the smaller the risk that they have to deal with. Because if one of their clients, one of their airlines struggles, defaults, dies, their risk has been spread across other customers as well. Today, some of the biggest players in this industry include Airlines Corporation, which has the third largest fleet right now with almost 500 planes serving over 100 airlines. Then you have Avalon, which owns/manages at least 550 planes and serves over 140 airlines. And the biggest fish, AerCap, with around 1,700 planes, eventually merged with ILFC, remember those guys, and then it merged with GE Capital. Today, about 60% of all planes in the skies are leased. For North America, that number is around 40%, mostly because the US still has easier access to capital, and because a new US law has closed some of the loopholes that allowed airlines to disguise some of these contracts in the way they reported to investors. In simple terms, what they were doing, or what they can't do anymore, is they can no longer pretend that those long-term plane rentals aren't real debts. They must now show every leased aircraft as both an asset and a corresponding liability on their balance sheet. If that's too complicated, never mind. Here's how that's distributed across airlines in the States today. In Asia and Latin America, for example, the percentage of leased planes is well over 70%. And so does this whole industry mean any risk to you as a passenger? Honestly, no, not really. Now, it probably feels easy to point the finger at the lessor when things go wrong. But these airplane leases we've been talking about, they're called dry leases, where the airline that is renting takes ownership of the plane and is 100% in charge of all maintenance, just as if it were their own plane. Now, under international law, aircraft lessors are generally shielded from liability for accidents unless they have actual possession or operation control of the plane at the time of the incident, which rarely happens. Now, because the airline flies, operates, maintains each plane, the buck tends to stop with them. And for the most part, that federal protection has stood up in court. Now, for recent plane tragedies like Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, Flight 17, Lion Air 610, Air Blue 202, the lessor was safe and sound. Now, did you notice that those lessors I mentioned are all Irish companies? 50% of the world's leased planes are managed out of Ireland. 14 out of 15 of the largest lessors in the world are based in Dublin. And when you're dealing in the billions of dollars in assets, even a half a percentage point means, millions of dollars. Ireland's applicable corporate tax for this business is 12.5%. That's almost half the rate in the US. Plus, Ireland has many supportive laws to deal with the complications of this billion-dollar balance sheet of planes. For example, they've standardized depreciation for planes, which allows companies to get better, easier tax deductions. Another big advantage is taxation treaties, because Ireland has treaties with over 70 countries, including all the major aviation markets. So if you run an airline out of a country with no tax treaty, you might end up paying a withholding tax on that lease, and every percentage counts. Try doing a 30% withholding tax on a $400,000 a month lease. It counts. And in the end, just Ireland helps reduce the risk of being an airplane lessor. Now, some people would call this a loophole, and some people might just call it a smart financial strategy. Because leasing companies are basically these invisible landlords of aviation who don't have to deal with the Karens at the airport, who get great tax breaks and have no concerns if the airplane crashes. What's not to like? On the other side, airlines figured out a way to outsource the risk of asset management and these mortgages to focus more on providing better customer service. Sometimes in business, centralizing everything is not the answer. And these kinds of symbiotic, risk-sharing relationships exist across many industries, especially when you have to deal with big budgets and huge liabilities. Trains get leased as well, for example. I don't know if you knew that. Now, don't forget to grab the Hustle's list of companies that are transforming transportation. And if you want to stay on this hidden air travel stuff videos, you should check my man Tori's video on why airports are full of fake restaurants. Catch you on the next one.